I found it folded at the bottom of his drawer, buried beneath socks that still smelled like the detergent his mother sent him every Christmas. My shirt, navy blue cotton, soft from years of washing, with a small hole near the left shoulder seam that I'd never bothered to mend. It was the kind of imperfection that made something feel real, lived in, human. The apartment was mostly empty now. 3 years of shared life reduced to boxes labeled in my careful handwriting. Kitchen, books, miscellaneous. The words looked too clean, too final. They couldn't capture the weight of what was ending, or the strange relief I felt watching it all disappear into cardboard containers. Marcus had left for work early that morning without saying goodbye. Not unusual, really. We'd been experts at avoiding difficult moments long before this one arrived. But I'd heard him moving around at dawn, quiet and deliberate, like he was trying not to wake me even though we both knew I was already awake, staring at the ceiling, counting down the hours until I could finish this and leave. The moving truck was coming at noon. I had 2 hours left in the space that had held us both, separately, together, for longer than either of us had planned. 2 hours to pack the last remnants of a life I was walking away from. Though walking felt too gentle a word for what I was doing. Fleeing, maybe. Escaping something that had grown too heavy to carry. I should have left the shirt where I found it. Should have pretended I hadn't seen it there, nestled between his things like it belonged to him now. But my hands moved before my mind could stop them, lifting the fabric, feeling its familiar weight. It was still warm, or maybe that was my imagination playing tricks. Memory has a way of adding sensation to things that should have none. He'd told me once, months ago, that it helped him sleep. We were both a little drunk that night, sitting on the couch watching some forgettable movie, and the confession had slipped out between sips of beer and comfortable silence. Something about the scent, he'd said, made him feel safe. Like being held without the complexity of actually being held. I told him he could keep it. The lie came so easily I almost believed it myself. Of course it didn't matter, I'd said, my voice steady and generous. Just a shirt, after all. Plenty more where that came from. He'd smiled then, grateful and guilty in equal measure, and I'd turned back to the television screen to hide the way my chest had tightened around those words. But it did matter. It mattered in ways I couldn't name without destroying the careful distance we'd maintained, the unspoken agreement that kept us safe in our separate orbits. Finding it there now, in his private space, felt like discovering evidence of something I'd tried so hard not to see. The room was dim, curtains drawn against the morning light. His bed was unmade, sheets twisted like he'd fought with sleep and lost. I could see the impression where his body had been, could imagine him there just hours before, curled around this piece of me he'd claimed as his own. The image flickered through my mind before I could stop it. Marcus, vulnerable in that space between sleeping and waking, breathing in whatever traces of myself still clung to the cotton fibers. I folded the shirt carefully, matching the creases he'd made, and placed it in the box marked with his name. Not because it belonged to him, exactly, but because keeping it would have felt like theft. Of what, I couldn't say. His comfort, maybe. His small rebellion against the boundaries we'd never discussed, but both understood. The silence in the apartment felt different now, charged with all the things we'd never said to each other. 3 years of almosts and not quites, of glances that lasted too long and touches that ended too soon. We'd built something together in that space, something unnamed and fragile, and now I was dismantling it piece by piece, box by box, lie by lie. In 2 hours, I would drive away from this place and start over somewhere else. I would create new routines, find new rhythms, learn to sleep without listening for his footsteps in the hallway. But first, I would finish packing. I would close the boxes and seal the tape and pretend that what we'd had could be contained so simply, reduced to objects and memories and the ghost of his scent on a shirt he'd never asked permission to keep. I hadn't intended to live with anyone when I first moved to Portland. The apartment was supposed to be mine alone, a sanctuary after years of shared spaces and compromised decisions. I'd chosen it for its quiet street in the Alberta district, far enough from downtown to feel residential, but close enough to bike to my design studio when the rain wasn't too harsh. 2 bedrooms, hardwood floors worn smooth by previous tenants, windows that faced east so I could drink my morning tea in actual sunlight. The spare room was meant to be an office. I'd imagine myself there on weekends, working on personal projects, maybe finally finishing the graphic novel I'd been sketching in margins for years. But Portland rent had its own plans for my intentions, and by month 3, I was scrolling through roommate apps with the resigned efficiency of someone who'd run the numbers too many times to ignore them. Marcus responded to my posting within hours. His message was brief, almost formal. Recently single, he wrote, looking for a quiet place to reset. Clean, respectful, good with tools if anything needs fixing. He attached a single photo, himself standing in front of a half-built bookshelf, holding a level, squinting slightly in the workshop light. There was something earnest about his expression, unguarded in a way that felt rare in dating app culture, even though this wasn't dating. We met at a coffee shop on Alberta Street. I arrived early, ordering my usual chamomile tea and claiming a corner table where I could see him coming. When he walked through the door, he was exactly what his photo had promised: tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of weathered hands that suggested real work rather than gym memberships. He wore a flannel shirt rolled to his elbows and jeans with sawdust still clinging to the cuffs. He said he was a carpenter, mostly residential work, some furniture commissions when he could find them. He'd been living with his girlfriend for 2 years until she decided she wanted different things. He didn't elaborate on what those things were, and I didn't ask. We talked about practical matters: rent, utilities, cleaning schedules, noise levels. He seemed genuinely interested in keeping things simple, respectful, temporary. I liked that word when he used it. Temporary suggested boundaries, clear expectations, an endpoint we could both see coming. It felt safe in a way that permanent arrangements never had for me. He moved in on a Saturday in October, carrying everything he owned in the bed of a pickup truck that had seen better decades. His possessions were sparse, practical: a mattress, a dresser, boxes of tools, a television that was older than my relationship with technology. He worked quietly, efficiently, asking where I preferred things to go, but never assuming he could claim more space than we'd agreed upon. I helped him carry the heavier pieces, and I noticed how careful he was with my things, stepping around the succulents I'd arranged on the windowsills, avoiding the stack of design books I'd left on the living room floor. There was a gentleness to his movements that seemed at odds with his size, the way someone handles borrowed objects that matter to the person who owns them. That first month, we were exactly what we'd promised to be: respectful strangers sharing resources. He left for work before I woke up, came home after I'd already started dinner. We'd nod at each other in the kitchen, make small talk about the weather or the neighbors' loud music, maintain the polite distance of people who knew this arrangement had expiration dates built into it. But temporary has a way of stretching when you're not paying attention. October became November, became winter, became a rhythm neither of us had planned, but both seemed reluctant to disturb. He fixed the bathroom faucet that had been dripping for months, replaced the burnt-out bulbs I kept forgetting to buy, weatherized the windows before the first real cold snap hit. I cooked more than I usually did, finding myself making portions for 2 without consciously deciding to do so. We began sharing meals, still polite but less careful about it. He'd come home to find dinner waiting and offer to do dishes in return. I discovered he'd left coffee brewing for me in the mornings, learning exactly how I liked it without either of us discussing the details. These small exchanges felt natural, like choreography we'd stumbled into rather than rehearsed. I learned his patterns. The way he left windows cracked even in February, claiming he slept better with fresh air. How he ate cereal directly from the box while standing at the counter, never bothering with bowls for his own convenience. The fact that he laughed at television shows I found only mildly amusing, his laugh filling the apartment with warmth I hadn't realized was missing. He never asked about my dating life, and I never asked about his. This felt like courtesy at first, then habit, then something more complicated. I would catch him glancing at my phone when it buzzed with text messages, see him look away quickly when I took calls in another room. But he never pressed for information, never made assumptions about who I might be talking to or where I went on evenings when I dressed more carefully than usual. In return, I didn't ask about the occasional late nights, the phone calls he took on the fire escape, the way he sometimes seemed to be waiting for news that never came. We had become experts at coexisting without trespassing, sharing a life without examining it too closely. The apartment itself changed around us. My things mixed with his things in ways that felt accidental but increasingly permanent. His coffee mug appeared in my cabinet. My books found their way to the table beside his chair. We bought groceries together without discussing it, splitting the cost and the labor like people who'd been doing this for years. By spring, neither of us mentioned moving out. The topic simply stopped coming up in conversation, disappeared like so many other subjects we'd learned not to pursue. I told myself this was practical, economical, nothing more complicated than two adults who'd found a functional arrangement. But late at night, lying in my bed listening to the sounds of him getting ready for sleep in the next room, I knew we'd crossed into territory neither of us had mapped. It started with rain. The kind of Portland rain that arrives in March and settles in like an unwelcome guest, persistent and cold, turning the world gray for weeks at a time. I was making tea in the kitchen when Marcus came home from work, shaking water from his jacket, his hair dark and damp against his forehead. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and I could see him shivering slightly, that involuntary tremor that comes from being cold too long. His work shirt was soaked through, clinging to his shoulders, and there was something vulnerable about the way he wrapped his arms around himself, trying to generate warmth. He asked if he could borrow something dry, just until his clothes were washed, he said, gesturing toward the pile of wet work clothes he'd left by the door. I handed him the hoodie I'd been wearing earlier, gray cotton with drawstrings he immediately pulled tight around his neck. It was too small for him, sleeves ending above his wrists, but he seemed grateful for the warmth. I expected him to return it that evening, or maybe the next morning, washed and folded the way he handled borrowed things. But days passed, and I'd see him wearing it around the apartment, first in the mornings when the air was still cold, then in the evenings when we watched television. The sight of him in my clothes created something strange in my chest, a flutter I couldn't quite name. When I finally mentioned it, casualty draped in humor, he looked embarrassed, started to pull it over his head right there in the living room. I told him he could keep it if he wanted. The words came out before I'd fully considered them, automatic and generous in the way that hides other intentions. He paused, the hoodie halfway off, and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Then he pulled it back down, tugged it into place, and said thank you in a voice that carried more weight than gratitude usually does. After that, it became a pattern I pretended not to notice. A flannel shirt I'd worn to the grocery store disappeared from my laundry basket, reappearing on his shoulders the next week. A long-sleeved thermal I'd thrown over a chair found its way to his room, then back to the living room wrapped around his frame while he drank morning coffee. Each time, I told myself it was practical, meaningless, the kind of thing that happens when people share space long enough. But I began to pay attention to which pieces he chose, and the pattern revealed itself slowly, reluctantly. He never took anything from my closet directly, never borrowed clothes I'd put away clean and unworn. Instead, he selected items from the transitional spaces, the chair where I draped shirts I'd worn but weren't quite ready for the wash, the basket where I collected things that still carried the day's warmth and scent. I started to wonder if this was conscious or instinctive, if he was drawn to these particular pieces for reasons he could articulate, or if his hands simply reached for what felt familiar, comforting, like some part of him recognized something in the fabric that he needed. The confession came on a night when we'd both been drinking, nothing excessive, just beer shared over a movie that neither of us was really watching. We were sitting closer than usual on the couch, the space between us reduced by comfort and alcohol, and the particular intimacy that develops between people who've learned each other's rhythms. He was wearing one of my t-shirts, soft gray cotton that had molded to his chest in ways that made it difficult for me to look directly at him. During a quiet moment in the film, he pulled the fabric to his face, an unconscious gesture, breathing in briefly before realizing what he'd done. He said it helped him sleep. The words came out quietly, almost apologetically, like he was confessing something shameful. Something about the scent, he explained, made him feel safe, like being wrapped in something that understood him, that had held warmth and given it freely. I asked him what he meant by safe, and he was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said it reminded him of something he missed, something he'd lost without fully understanding what it was. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't push, but the admission hung between us like a bridge neither of us was ready to cross. That same week, the email arrived. I almost deleted it without reading, recognizing the sender's name, but not immediately placing it in the context of my current life. David. 3 years since we'd spoken, longer since we'd been anything more than careful friends trying to navigate the aftermath of what we'd broken between us. He was moving to Portland, the message said. Work opportunity, fresh start. All the reasons people give for large changes that probably have smaller, more complicated roots. He wanted to catch up, if I was interested. Maybe grab coffee, see how I was doing, whether the city had been kind to me. I stared at the email for a long time, trying to remember what it felt like to love him, to believe that love could be something other than careful and cautious and constantly aware of its own fragility. We had been fire together, bright and consuming and ultimately destructive, burning through each other's defenses until there was nothing left but ash and the memory of warmth. The idea of seeing him again stirred something I'd thought I'd buried, some dormant part of myself that remembered what it felt like to be wanted completely, recklessly, without reservation. But it also made me aware of what my life had become, the quiet contentment I'd built with Marcus, the careful balance we'd achieved without ever acknowledging its existence. I wrote back, keeping my response neutral, friendly, the kind of message you send to someone who used to matter but might not anymore. Coffee sounded nice, I said. Portland was treating me well. I'd love to hear about his plans. But something shifted after that email, like a stone thrown into still water, ripples spreading outward in ways I couldn't control. I found myself pulling back from Marcus slightly, creating small distances where there hadn't been any before. When he reached for another piece of my clothing, I suggested he might want to do laundry instead. When he settled too close to me on the couch, I found reasons to move to the chair across the room. Marcus noticed. Of course he noticed. We'd been living in each other's orbit long enough that any change in gravitational pull registered immediately. He grew quieter, more careful around me, like he was trying to figure out what he'd done wrong or what had changed without his permission. One evening, he asked about the person in the email. He'd seen me typing on my phone, seen the way I'd smiled at whatever message I'd received, and his question caught me off guard with its directness. Just a friend, I told him, the lie smooth and automatic. Someone I used to know, nothing important. He nodded, accepting the explanation, but I could see something flicker across his face, something that looked like disappointment or maybe recognition. Like he knew I was lying, but couldn't call me on it without revealing how closely he'd been paying attention, how much my responses mattered to him. That night, I heard him moving around his room later than usual, restless sounds that drifted through the thin walls between us. I lay awake listening, wondering what he was thinking about, whether he was wearing one of my shirts while he struggled with whatever was keeping him from sleep. The changes started small, so subtle I almost convinced myself I was imagining them. Marcus began leaving things for me. My favorite granola bars on the kitchen counter, purchased during grocery runs I hadn't asked him to make. A new lamp appeared in my room one evening, replacing the broken one I'd been meaning to fix for months. When I asked about it, he shrugged and said he'd found it at a thrift store, thought I might like it. He started waiting up for me on nights when I worked late, not obviously, just happening to be awake when I came home, reading on the couch or watching television with the volume low. We'd exchange a few words about the day, nothing profound, but there was comfort in finding him there, in knowing someone had noticed my absence and marked my return. The physical space between us began to shrink in ways that felt accidental but weren't quite. We'd brush against each other in the narrow kitchen, his hand briefly touching my shoulder as he reached around me for something from the cabinet. When we sat together watching movies, the couch seemed smaller somehow, our legs nearly touching, the air charged with awareness we both pretended not to feel. One night, we were watching an old film I'd chosen, something black and white and quietly devastating. There was a scene where two men sat across from each other at a restaurant, their hands finding each other under the table, fingers intertwining with desperate secrecy. I felt Marcus shift beside me, sensed rather than saw him glance in my direction, but I kept my eyes fixed on the screen, afraid of what I might see in his face or what he might see in mine. That same night, he appeared in my doorway after I'd gone to bed, holding one of my shirts in his hands. It was a blue button-down I'd worn to a client meeting earlier that week, something I'd tossed over a chair without thinking about it. He said he'd washed it, wanted to return it, but then he hesitated, the fabric twisted between his fingers. He asked if I had anything he could borrow instead, something I hadn't washed yet. The request was quiet, almost embarrassed, and I felt something shift in my chest, understanding suddenly that this wasn't about convenience or practicality. This was about need, about something he couldn't articulate but couldn't stop himself from seeking. I gave him the t-shirt I'd been wearing that day, still warm from my body, still carrying whatever traces of myself he seemed to find essential. He thanked me without meeting my eyes and disappeared back to his room, leaving me alone with the clean shirt that no longer held any part of me. Our proximity began to feel inevitable, magnetic. I'd wake up on weekend mornings to find him asleep against my shoulder on the couch, both of us having fallen asleep during late-night movies. I never moved on those mornings, afraid to break whatever spell had allowed him to trust me with his unconscious vulnerability. I'd lie there feeling the weight of his head, the steady rhythm of his breathing, wondering if this was what contentment felt like or if I was confusing it with something more dangerous. The dinner with David happened on a Tuesday. I'd been nervous about it for days, changing clothes twice before settling on something that felt like myself, but also like someone worth reconnecting with. David looked older, more settled, but still carried that intensity that had drawn me to him years before. We talked about work, about Portland, about the ways people change and stay the same simultaneously. It felt easier than I'd expected, familiar in a way that surprised me. There were moments when I remembered why I'd loved him, could feel the ghost of that connection flickering between us. When he suggested we do this again soon, maybe dinner next time, I found myself saying yes before I'd fully considered what that meant. Marcus was waiting when I got home, not obviously, but there was something deliberate about the way he was reading in the living room, the lamp turned on like he'd been expecting me. He asked how it went, and I said it was nice, catching up with an old friend. But something in his expression told me he wasn't buying the casual tone I was working so hard to maintain. "So is he staying the night?" Marcus asked, and the question hit me like cold water, sudden and clarifying. There was something raw in his voice, something unguarded that made me understand I'd been naive about the careful distance we'd been maintaining. This wasn't just friendship or convenient cohabitation. This was jealousy, sharp and unmistakable. I told him no, David wasn't staying, that it wasn't that kind of dinner, but Marcus was already pulling back, retreating into the politeness we'd used to hide behind in the early months. He said good night and disappeared to his room, leaving me alone with the realization that something fundamental had shifted between us, something neither of us seemed equipped to handle. That night, I lay awake, understanding finally what was happening to me, what had been building between us in ways I'd refused to acknowledge. I was falling in love with someone who couldn't love me back. Or worse, someone who might be capable of loving me, but would never allow himself to cross that line, to risk what we'd built for something neither of us knew how to navigate. The grief of it felt immense, not because what we had wasn't enough, but because I could see how easily it could become everything if we were different people, braver people, people who knew how to want things without destroying them in the process. The days after my dinner with David moved like thick honey, everything slow and deliberate and heavy with unspoken tension. Marcus and I circled each other in the apartment like dancers who'd forgotten the steps, careful not to touch, careful not to look too long, careful not to acknowledge the electricity that seemed to crackle in the air between us whenever we shared the same room. He stopped borrowing my clothes. The shirts that had been disappearing from my laundry basket remained untouched. My hoodie stayed in my closet, and somehow this absence felt more significant than their taking ever had. I found myself missing the sight of him in my things, missing the strange intimacy of seeing my clothes shaped by his body, warmed by his presence. I caught him looking at me sometimes when he thought I wasn't paying attention, his expression unguarded and hungry in ways that made my chest tighten with something between hope and fear. But the moment he realized I'd noticed, he'd look away, retreat into the safe territory of mundane conversation about work or weather or anything that didn't require us to examine what was building between us. 3 weeks passed like this, and I began to think we might simply return to our previous equilibrium, that whatever had shifted between us would settle back into the comfortable patterns we'd established. Then Marcus appeared in my doorway one night, holding something in his hands, and I knew immediately that everything was about to change. It was one of my old t-shirts, faded green cotton that I hadn't seen in months. It was clearly wrinkled, obviously worn, and there was something almost ceremonial about the way he held it, like an offering or a confession he couldn't quite bring himself to speak. He stood there in the dim light spilling from the hallway, and I could see he was struggling with something, words forming and dissolving before they could take shape. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet and raw in the darkness. "This one," he said, holding up the shirt, "smells like you used to. Back when you laughed more. Before things got complicated between us. Before I started watching you pull away and not knowing how to stop it from happening." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. I had been pulling away, had been building walls I'd convinced myself were necessary, protective. But hearing him name it, hearing the hurt in his voice, made me realize how much damage I'd been doing to both of us in my attempt to keep us safe. He asked if he could keep the shirt, and I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. But something in my expression must have encouraged him, because he took a step into my room, close enough that I could smell his shampoo, could see the way his hands trembled slightly as he clutched the fabric. I finally asked the question I'd been avoiding for months. "Why do you want these clothes? Why ones I've worn? Why does it have to be pieces of me you're taking?" The silence that followed felt infinite, charged with all the things we'd been refusing to say to each other. Marcus's face crumbled, his careful composure dissolving, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Because it feels like the closest I'm allowed to be to you." Everything stopped. The air in the room went still, heavy, like the moment before lightning strikes. I felt my breath catch in my chest, felt the world shift on its axis in ways that couldn't be undone. Marcus stepped forward, uncertain but unable to stop himself, and I stepped back, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd just admitted. But stepping back didn't create the distance I'd intended. Instead, it brought us into sharper focus, made the space between us feel charged with possibility and terror in equal measure. I could see everything in his face then, all the careful control finally stripped away, and I understood that this moment had been inevitable, that we'd been moving toward it for months without admitting it to ourselves. Images flashed through my mind like a film reel spinning too fast. Marcus watching me across the dinner table with an expression I pretended not to recognize. The way his hand had lingered when our fingers brushed reaching for the same book. How he'd positioned himself on the couch so our knees would almost touch. How he'd grown still and attentive whenever I talked about work or dreams or anything that mattered to me. I saw it all suddenly, clearly, the careful choreography we'd been performing around our mutual attraction, the elaborate dance we'd created to keep ourselves close enough to feel connected but far enough apart to maintain plausible deniability. It hadn't been imagined. It had been real, electric, building pressure like a storm system that had finally reached the point where it had to break. Marcus was looking at me with something like desperation, like he'd finally jumped off a cliff and was waiting to see if I would catch him or let him fall. I wanted to move toward him, wanted to close the distance and discover what it would feel like to stop pretending, but fear held me frozen. Not fear of him, but fear of what this would mean, what we would become if we crossed this line. Later that night, I went to the kitchen for water, moving carefully through the darkened apartment. Marcus was there, silhouetted against the window, and I could tell by the tension in his shoulders that he hadn't been sleeping either. He turned when he heard me, and in the dim light filtering through the curtains, his face looked vulnerable, uncertain. We reached for glasses from the same cabinet, our hands colliding in the darkness. But instead of the quick apology and retreat that would have happened before, we both went still. His fingers covered mine, warm and slightly rough from work, and I felt him lean closer, felt his breath against my temple. For a moment, I let myself imagine what would happen if I turned toward him instead of away, if I let myself want this thing that felt both impossible and inevitable. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, could sense him gathering courage for something that would change everything between us. He leaned in, slowly, giving me time to stop him, time to step away, time to preserve the careful boundaries we'd spent so long constructing. But I didn't move. I let him come closer until I could feel his lips almost touching my cheek, until the space between us felt electric with possibility. Then something in him broke, and he pulled back suddenly, sharply, like he'd been burned. His hand dropped away from mine, and he stepped backward until the counter pressed against his spine. "I don't know what this means," he said, and his voice was raw with confusion and want and fear all tangled together. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this, how I'm supposed to handle feeling this way about you." I looked at him across the small space that felt like an ocean, and I understood that this was my choice point, my moment to decide whether to step toward him or away, whether to help him make sense of what was happening between us or to let him struggle with it alone. "I do know what it means," I told him, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "I know exactly what this is and what you're feeling because I've been feeling it too. But I won't beg for it, Marcus. I won't convince you that it's okay to want this. That has to come from you." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him processing my words, understanding that I'd just handed him permission and an ultimatum simultaneously. Then he turned and left the kitchen without another word, leaving me alone with the glasses we'd never filled and the weight of everything we'd finally said to each other. After that night in the kitchen, Marcus began avoiding me with the same careful precision he'd once used to seek closeness. He left for work earlier, came home later, timed his movements through the apartment to minimize our encounters. When we did cross paths, he was polite, distant, like we were strangers who'd been introduced once at a party neither of us had enjoyed. The borrowed clothes disappeared entirely. I found them washed and folded on my bed one afternoon, returned like library books whose loan period had expired. Even the green t-shirt from that night, the one he'd held like a lifeline, appeared among the others, smelling like detergent instead of him, stripped of whatever comfort he'd found in its fibers. We fell back into something that resembled our old routine, but it was brittle now, fragile in ways that made every interaction feel like walking on ice that might crack under the weight of a wrong word or glance. The television stayed on during meals to fill the silence that had once felt comfortable. We stopped sharing the couch, each claiming our own territory in the living room, invisible boundaries drawn and respected. I told myself this was what I'd wanted, what I'd asked for when I refused to beg for his affection. But the apartment felt hollow now, emptied of the warmth that had grown between us over months of careful intimacy. I missed the version of Marcus who had waited up for me, who had left granola bars on the counter, who had stolen pieces of my clothing like they were treasures worth hoarding. David and I had dinner again, then coffee, then a long walk through the neighborhoods I'd come to think of as mine and Marcus's. He was kind, familiar, everything that should have felt like coming home. When he kissed me goodnight after our third meeting, I kissed him back, trying to remember what it felt like to want someone who could want me openly, without reservation or fear. But even with David's arms around me, even with the promise of something straightforward and reciprocal, I found myself thinking about Marcus alone in the apartment, probably wearing his own clothes now, sleeping without the comfort of borrowed fabric that carried traces of someone else's presence. The decision to leave formed slowly, like sediment settling at the bottom of a clear glass. I couldn't continue living in the space between what we'd almost been and what we'd never allow ourselves to become. The apartment had become a museum of moments that had meant too much to him and not enough to me, or vice versa, depending on the day. I started looking at other places, small studios and one-bedrooms that would be mine alone, spaces where I wouldn't have to negotiate the territory between friendship and something more complex. I didn't tell Marcus I was looking, but he must have sensed something changing in my behavior, some shift in the way I moved through rooms that had held us both. On a Thursday evening in late spring, I cooked dinner for us one final time. Nothing elaborate, just pasta with the sauce he'd always said he liked, bread from the bakery we'd discovered together during one of our early grocery runs. I set the table with real plates instead of the paper ones we'd been using lately, poured wine into glasses that had gathered dust since winter. Marcus ate in silence, glancing at me occasionally with something that looked like suspicion, like he knew this meal was different but couldn't identify why. The food tasted like memory, like every shared evening we'd spent learning each other's preferences and rhythms. I watched him eat and tried to memorize the way he held his fork, the small crease that appeared between his eyebrows when he was thinking. After we'd finished, after I'd cleared the plates and he'd folded his napkin with characteristic precision, I told him I was moving out. The words came out steady, matter-of-fact, like I was announcing a change in the weather. He looked at me like I'd struck him, his face cycling through confusion, hurt, and something that might have been panic. "Why?" he asked, and the single word carried the weight of everything we'd been unable to say to each other. "Because I want something real," I told him. "And this, whatever this was between us, you were never ready for it. I can't keep living in the space where we almost love each other, but never quite get there." Something cracked in his expression then, the careful control he'd been maintaining since our kitchen encounter finally giving way. He said he hadn't meant to hurt me, that he'd never expected to feel something like this, that the intensity of it had caught him completely off guard. He was scared, he admitted, of what it meant, of what people would think, of how to be something he'd never imagined himself being. I was scared too, I replied, but I still showed up. I still let myself feel it, even knowing it might destroy the friendship we'd built. You never gave us that chance. We sat there in the ruins of our careful distance, both understanding that this conversation had come too late to change anything. Whatever we might have been to each other, we'd missed our moment, lost it in the space between his fear and my refusal to accept half measures. That night, I went to his room one last time. He wasn't there, had gone out somewhere, maybe to think or drink or find someone who could offer simpler comfort than what we'd tangled ourselves into. I left something on his bed, folded neatly like he'd always done with my things when he returned them. It was the gray hoodie, the first piece of mine he'd ever borrowed, the one he'd worn on that rainy afternoon when this whole complicated dance had begun. I'd washed it, but lightly, so it still carried traces of both of us, still held the memory of being shared between two people who had found each other by accident and lost each other through fear. I didn't leave a note. There was nothing left to say that we hadn't already said or failed to say when it might have mattered. Instead, I closed his door quietly and went to finish packing my own life into boxes labeled with destinations that didn't include him. In the morning, he'd find the hoodie and understand that this was my goodbye, my acknowledgement that what we'd built together had been real enough to grieve, even if it had never been strong enough to survive our own limitations. I moved out on a Saturday morning when the city was still quiet, when the streets held that particular silence that comes with early light and the promise of rain. The moving truck was smaller than I'd expected, a compact acknowledgement that 3 years of shared life hadn't accumulated as many possessions as I'd imagined. Most of what mattered couldn't be packed anyway. The rhythm of morning coffee made for two, the comfortable weight of someone else's presence in adjacent rooms, the particular quality of silence that exists between people who've learned to read each other's moods. My new apartment was across town, a studio in a building that faced west instead of east, where the light would hit differently, where I'd have to learn new patterns for how the sun moved through unfamiliar windows. It was smaller than what I'd left behind, but it was entirely mine, unmarked by compromise or the careful negotiations that had shaped my life with Marcus. The space felt vast despite its modest square footage, empty in ways that had nothing to do with furniture and everything to do with the absence of another person's breathing, another person's schedule, Another person's needs woven into the fabric of daily existence. I set my boxes down in the center of the room and stood looking at them. These containers that held everything I decided was worth keeping from the life I was leaving behind. Unpacking felt overwhelming, so I didn't. Instead, I found my tea kettle, filled it with water from a tap that would take weeks to stop feeling foreign under my hands, and waited for it to boil in a kitchen that was too small for two people but perfect for one. The ritual was familiar even in this strange space. Chamomile tea, honey, a few minutes of quiet before facing whatever came next. I sat on the hardwood floor with my back against the wall, holding the warm mug between my palms, and breathed fully for what felt like the first time in months. The exhale was long, cleansing, like releasing something I'd been holding too tightly for too long. There was grief in it, yes, but also relief, the particular peace that comes with making a difficult decision and following it through to its conclusion. The boxes could wait. The unpacking, the arrangement of objects into a new life, the slow process of transforming space into home, all of that could happen gradually when I was ready. For now, it was enough to sit in the quiet and let myself feel the weight of what I'd chosen, what I'd left behind, what I might still become. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus was discovering what I'd left for him. I imagined him returning to the apartment after I'd gone, maybe from wherever he'd spent the night, maybe just from a long walk meant to clear his head. The rooms would feel different immediately, emptier in obvious ways, but also somehow larger, like spaces that had been holding their breath could finally exhale. He would notice the missing pieces gradually. The gap on the bookshelf where my designed books had been, the bare spot on the kitchen counter where my tea kettle had lived, the way the living room looked when arranged for one person instead of two. But it would be in his own room that the full reality of my departure would hit him. There, on his bed, would be the box I'd left behind. Unmarked, unremarkable, the kind of cardboard container that could hold anything or nothing. He would approach it slowly, maybe sensing that whatever was inside would require more from him than simple discovery. Inside, nestled in tissue paper like something precious, would be the gray hoodie. The first piece of mine he'd ever borrowed, the one that had started this whole complicated dance between us. It would still be folded the way I'd left it, still carrying traces of both of us, still holding the memory of that rainy afternoon when he'd asked for something dry and I'd given him something that would change everything between us. He would lift it from the box carefully, the way someone handles evidence of a life they'd almost lived. The fabric would be soft in his hands, familiar, and when he brought it close to his face, he would breathe in slowly, deeply, searching for whatever comfort he'd always found in the scent of my clothes. Maybe he would understand then what I'd been trying to tell him all along, that love doesn't require permission, but it does require courage. That wanting someone is not the same as knowing how to love them. That sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to stop asking them to be ready for something they can't handle. Or maybe he would simply hold the hoodie and remember the weight of opportunity missed, the space between almost and never, the particular ache that comes with understanding something important too late to matter. I would never know which. That was part of what I'd accepted when I chose to leave. That his story would continue without me, that whatever he made of what we'd been to each other would happen outside my knowledge, beyond my ability to influence or understand. Some things are never spoken. Some things never need to be. But sometimes, silence is its own kind of answer, and the space between words holds more truth than language ever could. What Marcus and I had built together existed in that space, real and unnamed, precious and impossible, like morning light caught briefly in glass before the sun moves on and leaves only memory and the faint warmth of something beautiful that couldn't last. I finished my tea as the afternoon light began to slant through my new windows, painting the unfamiliar walls with unfamiliar shadows. Tomorrow I would start unpacking. I would arrange my books on new shelves, hang my clothes in a closet that belonged only to me, begin the process of building a life that didn't require me to love carefully or at a distance. But tonight, I would sit in the quiet and let myself grieve what we'd been and celebrate what we'd never quite become. Both felt necessary. Both felt true.